Hello, and thanks for coming to this virtual panel. What I'm presenting today is my chapter from an upcoming collection I've put together with Ida Yoshinaga and Sean Gynes, Uneven Futures, Lessons for Community Survival from Speculative Fiction, which is forthcoming from MIT Press. It takes its name, as you probably expect, from that famous quote by William Gibson. The future is already here, it just isn't very evenly distributed. The book brings together think-piece-length critical essays from nearly 40 critics, artists, and activists, who each take up some core text of the genre with an eye towards the articulation of some new paradigm for thinking about SF that would be suitable for an era in which the global capitalist consensus is so riven by intersecting crises that it just seems ready to explode at any moment. And despite how grim that sounds, the book is actually terrific fun. I'd love to talk more about it. My chapter of the book is titled Watchmen number 11, Autonomous Collectivity Against the State. It comes in part out of a comics and graphics narrative class that I taught last fall, which was also super fun, which was centered on the original Watchmen series and its various transmedia sequels, prequels, expansions, and extensions. In particular, I call attention to an overlooked moment near the climax of Warren Gibson's narrative that offers a different conception of what our relationship to violence might be, rather than the kind of smash 'em up, kill 'em all ethos that still dominates superhero narrative. My chapter is just a bit longer than the length requirement for this video, so I had to skimp a bit on plot summary. But I'd be happy to talk more about this or my Watchmen class or anything else in the Q&A. Okay, so to begin. There may still be no superhero narrative more influential than Watchmen, published in 12 issues between 1986 and 1987 by DC Comics, and remaining a perennial bestseller ever since. Watchmen is neither the first nor the last story to explore the seedy underbelly of America's superhero fantasy, but it is viewed by many as the definitive articulation of the possibilities and pitfalls of the genre, revealing crime fighters as hypocrites, perverts, and megalomaniacs, rather than paragons or moral exemplars. Since its publication, the novel functions almost as a curse on the superhero genre. However much later creators try to wriggle out of its grasp and return to some earlier state of innocence for the superhero, somehow the stories always come back to the unhappy terms laid out by Moore, Gibbons, and Higgins in Watchmen. Do heroes destroy more than they save? Does the violence they deal out unevenly across class, race, gender, and ethnic lines serve any goal other than the wretched reproduction of the status quo? What would it take for the superhero to be radical rather than reactionary, to envisage utopian possibility rather than the anti-utopian confirmation that the only true moral authority is power? Since their formation in the World War II era, American comics have positioned the superhero as a figuration for state power, both at the level of the beat cop, right? Mr. Fantastic using his amazing powers and brilliant intellect to catch bank robbers rather than cure cancer. Batman burning his billion-dollar inheritance on more and more complex ways to beat up the unhoused and the mentally ill. And at the level of the national imperial imaginary, right? Superman's truth, justice, and the American way. Captain America kind of punching out Hitler on the cover of Captain America #1. Watchmen suggests that this path is a moral and political dead end. Instead, we must reject the superhero, the book argues, and in turn reject the traditional forms of authority that the superhero has always represented. In this way, Watchmen positions itself as the last superhero story. Right? Not the last one ever published, but probably the last one you ever need to read. And so this part is where I'm cutting a little bit of plot summary. I apologize. We're going to cut all the way to the end. In issue number 12, after the anti-hero Rorschach has been summarily executed by the godlike Dr. Manhattan, the other heroes agree to accept the anti-hero Ozymandias' devil's bargain, and the story ends on the cusp of Ozymandias' utopia, with only Rorschach's journal, the last outstanding piece of evidence that could unravel the new dawn. The book thus ends with a renewed and reinvigorated America. Veit's multinational now sells Millennium-branded products instead of nostalgia-branded products, with a bloody secret lurking at its core. At risk of exposure and return to our own apocalyptic status quo at any moment. Thus, the final judgment of Watchmen, right? Our worship of heroes, all the politicians, the agents, the entire superhuman crew, leads us in the end to a miserable forced choice between two equally unacceptable nightmares. Neither governability, which is Ozymandias, right, nor ungovernability, Rorschach, points towards anything like truth or justice, to say nothing of what we might euphemistically still call the American way. So that's the end of the whole series. But at the end of the penultimate issue, issue 11, we see the possibility of a different line of flight out of this conundrum. As Rorschach and his companion Night Owl confront Ozymandias at his Antarctic retreat, still incorrectly believing that they can stop him in time, the narrative takes a brief moment to check in on the decidedly mundane, non-vigilante characters who have populated the background of the series since issue number 1. We've seen these characters in different contexts across the book. There's street-level cops. There's a lesbian couple doing outreach work for a political activist group called GWAR, Gay Women Against Rape. There's a devoted fan of pirate comics, bantering with the owner of a local newsstand about whether or not he's ever going to buy anything. All of these background characters converge by chance in Times Square, where they witness a moment of domestic violence between two women on the street. In a more optimistic psychic replay of the Kitty Genovese myth that first inspired Rorschach's kind of grim, brutal retribution, these characters autonomously, collectively decide to intervene, working together to stop the violence before it spirals out of control. One of these characters is none other than Malcolm Long, a police psychologist who interviewed Rorschach earlier in the series and whose life has basically spiraled out of control ever since. Disturbed, distracted, and on the brink of divorce, he finds himself called to help. This moment, rather than anything to do with the superheroes, is what I would argue is the actual moral heart of the entire series. As Long explains to his wife, who is begging him to just stay out of it, "Gloria, please, I have to. In a world like this, it's all we can do to try to help each other. It's all that means anything." His disillusioning encounter with Rorschach and his disturbing vision of the ultimate meaninglessness of all things has called on him to try to craft a new moral order out of the chaos of the universe, like Rorschach does, but without Malcolm having to become like yet another Rorschach, right? Malcolm realizes he can heal rather than hurt. The ordinary, selfless heroism of these characters in this moment stands in very stark contrast to those of the superheroes across the novel, all of whom are barely disguised allegories for the forces of U.S. imperialism, state violence, callous business elites. Indeed, in this precise moment, the failed heroes Rorschach and Night Owl are already in Ozymandias' Antarctic compound, where they confront but fail to stop the hero-turned-mass murderer, whose twisted project of world transformation Night Owl will ultimately endorse. In issue number 11, Malcolm and the other background characters offer an alternative, right? They offer this rare, genuinely utopian glimmer for the book, coming together without technocratic leadership or police coercion to simply try to help the world where they can, how they can. At which time, they are all promptly murdered, along with millions of other New Yorkers, as the necessary collateral damage of Ozymandias' grand plan for a better tomorrow. The familiar 3x3 panel construction used almost uniformly across the rest of Watchmen breaks down in this moment, as the book's famously vivid coloration washes out to black and white and finally to pixelation, calling our attention to the importance of this singular moment in the text. The shadow imagery recalls the Hiroshima lovers that are referenced elsewhere in the novel, which themselves mirror the last embraces that were recorded by heat and ash after the dropping of the nuclear bomb. It's ordinary acts of love and decency, of kindness, that the unbounded mega-violence of the hero form, right, good men like my father and President Truman, to quote Rorschach from the book's first page, this is what the hero form kind of ultimately snuffs out. The Times Square subplot, the book's only positive gesture towards the possibility of any moral order that is neither murderous utopianism nor murderous nihilism, has been largely invisible in expansions and transmedia extensions of the Watchmen franchise. From Zack Snyder's critically derided 2009 film adaptation to the before Watchmen prequels, the HBO sequel, all of which essentially ignore Long entirely. Only the 2017 to 2019 comic sequel Doomsday Clock takes real note of Long's subplot and tries to do anything with it, putting his and Gloria's surviving son, Reggie, behind the mask as Rorschach too. Though the series ultimately loses interest in the character and treats Malcolm only as a figure for grief rather than as an aspiring vision of what a different sort of heroism might look like. Instead, Doomsday Clock seems to argue the only possible solution to the problem of superheroes is more superheroes. Superman's red boots stomping on a human face forever. If Watchmen is in some basic sense the last superhero narrative, the final disproof that the cultural celebration of benevolent Ubermensch offers anything useful for us, either politically or ethically, it is noteworthy that both fan response and the numerous highly problematic attempts to expand the Watchmen narrative to prequels, sequels, other kinds of homages and ripoffs have all been utterly fixated on the flashy, superpowered badasses who occupy the foreground of the narrative. And this is true, too, of successor franchises like the Arrowverse and the MCU. Right? The quippy violence remains the splash, the headline, the billion-dollar box office. There isn't much in the way of Malcolm Long fandom or cosplay. But it's only in the blighted and prematurely clipped possibility of Watchmen's ennobled background characters, murdered precisely by a man who claims to know how to save the world through yet another remorseless application of the violence that has doomed it, that offers any way out of the alienating and disempowering trap that capitalism, meritocracy, patriarchy, and the state have laid out for us. Perhaps it's not all that surprising that a superhero media industrial complex that has been compulsively reenacting Watchmen for the last 35 years has managed to miss its anti-superhero moral lesson. And as the center-left in the United States lurches from anti-fascist revulsion towards Trump, towards renewed national greatness liberalism under the Biden and Harris administration, perhaps we could all stand to have a reminder. Neither Nixon nor Redford, neither Rorschach nor Ozymandias, no cops, no presidents, no gods, no masters, only us trying to help. Thank you.